Hey guys, Aaron Cybertron Zeng here, and today I am back with the third episode of Trainer Tip Tuesdays, a new weekly series on this channel where I cover one aspect of Pokemon VGC and give you a bunch of tips and pointers in improving in that aspect. The first episode we looked at Team Preview, last week we looked at ways in improving your game in general, and today we'll be covering Best of 3 play. I think this is pretty important because basically all high-level VGC is done in best of 3. You know, the World Championships is exclusively best of 3, both in Swiss and in Top Cut, and if you ever make it to the Top Cut of any live tournament, you'll be playing best of 3. So it is a change of pace from the best of 1 play we are normally used to. So without further ado, let's just jump into it. And as always, if you enjoyed the series, please show your support by leaving a like on the video. Just takes a quick second and it would mean a lot to me. Anyway, I think the first thing we should point out, are the differences between best of 3 and best of 1. It's kind of self-explanatory, but I feel like they're still important enough that we should cover it. So obviously, best of 1, you just play 1 game, and best of 3, you play up to 3 games, and, playing 3 games is completely different from playing 1 game of Pokemon. I think one thing that a lot of players fail to realize is that in best of 3, your goal isn't to win 1 game, it's to win 2 games. So a lot of the times players will overextend themselves to win that first game and then have no options whatsoever left for the second and third game and then just get swept. So I think you should really remember that your goal isn't to win game 1 or to win game 2 exclusively, it's to win 2 of the 3 games you have to play. So that's really important, and we'll get into this later on, but it means you have to be a bit more conservative in terms of playstyle and revealing information. Another thing that separates best of 3 from best of 1 is that in best of 1, a lot of the times you don't have enough time to really take the information you're given and use it to your advantage. For example, a lot of the times you'll realize what your opponent's item is after it reveals itself, but at that point, it's already too late to play accordingly. In best of 3, after you find out what your opponent's items are or movesets are or whatever, you can use that to your advantage because in the second or third game, you'll actually know before anything else, so you'll have that prior knowledge, and that can go a long way. In addition, you can also learn about how your opponent plays. It's really difficult to adjust your playstyle during a best of 1 match, mainly because at that point, the game has probably progressed so far to the point where it's really difficult to make big plays and, play accordingly. But in best of 3, perhaps you learn in the previous games that, oh, your opponent's a player that doesn't like to protect at all, or your opponent's a player that likes to make a lot of switches and protect and gain momentum. In best of 3, you can really use that to your advantage because, you can turn yourself from a more aggressive player to a more defensive player or vice versa. And that's a pretty important thing to really acknowledge. Sometimes you do have to adjust the way you play in order to get one step up above your opponent. Additionally, in best of 1, it's really hard to pull off, or best of 3 I should say, it's really hard to pull off gimmick strategies. For example, strategies like minimize, perish trap, etc. A lot of the times your opponent will be able to figure out every single move you have on your team and play accordingly, so even if they lose that first game, it's really difficult to pull the same strategy off for another win. So that's why a lot of the times, strategies like Perish Trap, like Minimize, etc. Maybe we'll make it to the first round of Top Cut of a tournament but won't advance any further because more experienced players will know how to play accordingly and beat them. And then finally, in Best of 3, I generally feel like you have more room for error and risks. In best of 1, personally, I like to just play as safe as possible because you never want to overextend yourself and then, fall victim to a surprise moveset, Pokemon, etc. Whereas in best of 3, sometimes, you have that leeway. If you're up a game and you feel like, okay, if I'm going to take this risk, if it pays off, then I just win the series outright, and if not, I still have another game to recover. You kind of have room for error, and you have room to make those big plays, whereas in best of 1, a lot of the times you want to just stick to the safer plays. So that is kind of the beauty of best of 3 as well. You can make some bigger plays, and sometimes they may pay off and reward you heavily, other times they won't, but the main thing is you still have more games to recover, regardless of the result. So, game 1, in my opinion, is the most important game in best of 3. It's the one where it's basically like a normal, best of 1 match, and I generally treat it as a best of 1 match. So when I say that, I mean, you should play as safe as possible, never overextend yourself, don't be too aggressive, just play as normally as you would in a best of 1 match because you won't have any information before that actual game. The main focus is really, in my opinion, to gather information, but at the same time, you should still try to win. You shouldn't go into a best of 3 and be like, alright, I don't care whether I win or lose game 1, because if you win game 1, it really gives you a huge advantage mentally. So, obviously the goal is to win, but at the same time, you also want as much information as possible, because typically the best of 3 players will be able to absorb that information and use it to your advantage going into games 2 and 3. Playing a game of Pokemon without any information as opposed to playing a game of Pokemon with a lot of information. They're really two completely different regards, and one way to get better in best of 3 play is really to just improve how you can use the information you're given to your advantage and how you can get into your opponent's head. A bunch of things that I would really pay attention to when you're, playing that first game is how your opponent's team functions. So analyze, does it rely on a certain type of strategy, or is it just a bunch of strong Pokemon stringed together? Are there certain trends that I see my opponents, doing? Is there a certain way that my opponent's playing, their play style? And of course you want to note their items, natures, moves, and whatnot if you can, because that goes a long way as well. You should also really pay attention to speed. Speed's really important because of course it dictates the whole matchup. So if you can figure out how fast exactly some of your opponent's Pokemon are, and of course this is really helpful for Pokemon that can be either run really fast or, bulky. For example, Thundurus, which can either be used to take advantage of its base 111 speed, or often tends to be run more bulkier. So, in best of 1, a lot of players can rely on that gimmick if they're using, for example, a fast offensive Thundurus. Whereas in best of 3, if you do know that your opponent's not as bulky as normal Thundurus and it's faster, you can obviously use that to your advantage. However, the difference in playing game 1 in a best of 3 and just playing a best of 1 match is that, like I said, you can play a bit riskier knowing that you have 2 more games. I tend to not play riskier, but sometimes you do have, those plays that you can make, and maybe you wouldn't make them in a best of 1 scenario, but in a best of 3 scenario where you have 2 more games to recover and you're feeling confident about that set, then sometimes, players do go for that riskier move. But that is something you have to consider when you're playing the match. And then so after game 1, obviously you have to look forward to games 2 and 3. I think the most important thing to really acknowledge is you should never let your opponent pull off the same strategy twice. And what I mean by that is you should never let them, if they, for example, beat you a certain way, beat you that same way again. Of course, we do get into a lot of mind games, and that is a pretty generic statement. A lot of the times you'll actually be put in a pretty scary situation where you'll have the exact same scenario from the previous game, and then you'll get into some mind games and you have to ask yourself, do I think my opponent's going to make the same moves and so I predict accordingly, or do I think they're going to switch things up? More often, I'd say they would switch things up and play things a bit differently, but that is really difficult, and this guide in general is a bit hard to make because it's really situational based. But in general, what I mean is you never want to lose the same way, and your opponent generally, if they won game 1, for example, a certain way, they'll probably be going for that same strategy again, maybe changing things up slightly, but in general, realize that a lot of the times players like to stick with the same strategy if it worked out for them the first time around. You also really want to analyze how game 1 went. These are things I ask myself, did I win or lose because of a certain Pokemon or strategy? If so, for example, if I lost to a certain Pokemon, I'm definitely going to be changing my team up for the next round, making sure that I have a better Pokemon to beat that Pokemon I lost to. So, sometimes you feel unconfident, you bring the 4 safest Pokemon, and then you realize, wow, my team is really weak to that one Pokemon my opponent brought. So, you should adjust accordingly because chances are they're going to be bringing that Pokemon again. Sometimes you'll get lucky, you'll end up winning, and you'll realize, wow, if my opponent brought this other Pokemon, that could have given me a lot of trouble. So for example, let's say your team is really weak to Talonflame, but for some reason your opponent didn't bring Talonflame in game 1 because they felt like it wasn't worth bringing, and you win by a wide margin. Chances are, for example, in game 2, they're going to end up bringing that Talonflame. And once again, these are generic statements, but my point here is sometimes, your opponent will realize, wow, I should have brought this Pokemon, so you should try to realize when they're going to make that realization. Another question I ask myself after game 1 is, did I win or lose because one player played better? A lot of the times, if the answer to this, if the answer is I played better or I played worse as opposed to, oh, a certain Pokemon or strategy beat me, I'm not going to change my team up as much, and that's a pretty important factor because the 4 Pokemon you choose is really essential to a match. So, maybe sometimes after game 1, I feel like there was 1 or 2 plays I could have made better and I would have ended up winning. And a lot of the times when I feel that way, I'm not going to change my Pokemon at all because I feel like I just have to outplay my opponent, as opposed to other times where I say to myself, okay, I really need to change Pokemon up. So you really want to get into your opponent's head because they're going to be asking the same questions to themselves. And accordingly, like I mentioned, in game 1, you'll really get a sense of how your opponent's going to play. So try to adjust from that, point out some trends that they make, realize that how they play, whether it's more aggressive or defensive, etc. I think that's a pretty important regard, and it is really difficult really to say, oh, just adjust your play style, and I think that's something that comes naturally, but what I mean is you should really pay attention to common trends and ways your opponent tends to play and try to take advantage of that, because if you end up losing to a certain play style and you don't change anything, chances are you're just going to lose to that same kind of play style again. So I'm going to give you an example best of 3 set. This is one I had against Angel Miranda at a Premier Challenge in the very beginning of the season. His team was on top: Gengar, Terrakion, Gastrodon, Mega Salamence, Ferrothorn, and Ninetales. Mine is on bottom with Gengar, Hydreigon, Bisharp, Mega Salamence, Terrakion, and Mungus. Now the reason I refer to this set is because first of all, I went down to 3 games. Second of all, interestingly enough, neither Angel or I actually changed our team composition. We ended up bringing the same 4 Pokemon, the same order, all 3 games. So Angel ended up going with Gengar and Terrakion as his leads with Gastrodon and Salamence, while I opted with Gengar, Hydreigon, Bisharp, and Salamence, keeping Terrakion and Mungus on the bench. And I feel like this is a pretty good, this is a good reference to what I was saying earlier. This set was one of the cases where neither of us felt like we really had the urge to change our teams, because we felt like the 4 Pokemon we were bringing were the right Pokemon, and rather we just felt like we were winning or losing because of how we were playing. So, you know, I was running a Scarf Hydreigon at that point, and if you just look at Angel's team, Scarf Hydreigon beats everything but Terrakion, and that's why Angel felt the pressure to lead with Terrakion, because otherwise my Hydreigon would give so much pressure. That is why I led with my Hydreigon as well, and I had Gengar there because I knew my Gengar could beat his Terrakion. You know, I didn't bring my own Terrakion or Amoonguss because it's not like Amoonguss fares too well against a Mega Salamence or against a Gengar that can taunt it, and Terrakion doesn't like getting intimidated. I didn't want to risk speed ties, Gastrodon can one-hit KO it, etc. So this was one of the cases where neither of us just needed to change our Pokemon whatsoever. And the way I see it in best of 3, one of the most important aspects is the Pokemon you end up bringing. So sometimes, like I said, you'll want to change because you'll realize I'm really weak to this one Pokemon, but other times you'll realize that 2 Pokemon or 1 Pokemon are just not good for the matchup whatsoever. So it does make your job a bit easier because, you know, you'll immediately know what Pokemon to bring, but that is something you'll want to practice a lot too, realizing which Pokemon to bring and how to adjust after you see your opponent's team, because sometimes you'll realize your opponent's items and natures, and that might prompt you to bring a different Pokemon to deal accordingly. So a couple of tips I can give you. First of all, notes are so good in best of 3. I always take notes in Pokemon because first of all, you're allowed to. Second of all, there's no reason not to, you know. I mean, I guess it could distract you here and there, but notes can be really simple. When in best of 1 play, all I honestly do is just jot down my opponent's Pokemon, because that's all I need to do. In best of 3 play, I'll note a couple of more things, you know, I'll write their items, moves, and any other key notes. For example, if a certain Pokemon outsped another Pokemon which I didn't expect it to, I'll jot that down. I also keep track of Trick Room, weather turns, etc. So notes are helpful in general, but they're especially helpful in best of 3 because you can refer to it. It's always nice just having a sheet of paper in front of you, knowing, you know, half of your opponent's team going into game 2 or game 3. Also, you should never reveal any information unless you really need to. I feel like a lot of the times players will get more careless at the end of the game, and instead of making or using an attack they already revealed to win the game, they'll use another attack. And of course, sometimes you might want to go for that attack because, you know, it's more accurate. For example, revealing that you have Earth Power as opposed to Draco Meteoring for the win. But a lot of other times players will just go for attack when there's absolutely no need to, and that actually can help your opponent because best of 3 is all about an information game. So never use a move unless you absolutely have to or you feel like it will give you the win, as opposed to, oh, let me just make this move because I can. And, you know, this next point goes into what I was saying earlier, but never feel pressure to change your team unless you really feel like you're weak to something. Sometimes it really is better to just go with the same Pokemon and play differently. Also remember that there is a pretty big difference between making smart risks and making bad plays. You know, a bad play is something that just has a low kind of percentage in terms of coming out positive. It's very risky, you know, there's only one certain move your opponent can make where you would benefit from it, as opposed to a smart risk where, you know, in a best of 3 game, maybe you feel like, okay, I'm going to make this risk because, like I said, it could pay off heavily if if it works out, and if it doesn't, I might lose, but I still have another game or 2 to recover from. So while in best of 3, you have that room to make more riskier plays, that's not an excuse for you to make outright bad plays. So you should still consider probability and whatnot when, you know, making those plays. Also, one thing I, mentioned earlier is winning game 1. A lot of players, they'll tell you, oh, best of 3, you should just try to get as much information as possible, whatnot. It doesn't matter whether you win or lose. But I disagree to a certain extent. I think winning game 1 is a huge step mentally. And a lot of the times, if you win game 1, your opponent is going to be kind of one step behind you in terms of adjusting. So even if they manage to get the better of you in game 2, you'll have that knowledge of game 1 and game 2. And I feel like going into game 3, when I win game 1, I just feel so much more confident mentally. Though a lot of players also have that momentum, and after losing a game and winning game 2, they use that to their advantage. But my point is, don't just give up game 1 and try to in hopes of getting information. You should always try to be one step of your opponent, because if you can think the way they do, that can really help you out, and in my opinion, winning game 1 goes a long way in that. I think one of the worst mistakes you can do in a best of 3 is not choosing the right Pokemon. You know, you'll be so focused on the team matchup games 1 and 2, and game 3 you'll overextend yourself. You'll be like, oh, there's no way he or she's going to bring that Pokemon. He didn't bring it the first 2 games. And then you end up facing one of your worst matchups and you realize, wow, I have 0 ways to beat it. I feel like this is a pitfall that a lot of good players fall into, including myself. So at the end of the day, just make sure that the 4 Pokemon you bring can beat everything regardless of what your opponent brings. Definitely don't feel flustered by one loss. For example, a lot of players will lose that first game and automatically just give up. They'll be like, oh, there's no way I can win this set, whatnot. But you should really treat each game as its own while using all the information you have. What I mean by that is, obviously, if you lose game 1, you know, get focused, treat game 2 as any normal game, but at the same time, don't just make it a normal game, because you have more information than you would in, for example, a best of 1 match. So, you know, I've referred to information a lot, and that's because information is so important in best of 3. And like I said, this is really something you have to practice with. But the whole point of best of 3 is who is the player who can use the information they're given in the first couple of games and ultimately win. And that's why in best of 1 I like to play, safer. If you're a player that likes to play safer, I think the first game really rewards you, because not only do you get information, but you also just, manage to get the best of your opponent. But then games 2 and 3 are just so important. I think a common pitfall that a lot of players do when they are in best of 3 is they don't really realize how to adjust. They'll play the same game, they'll play, do the same kind of strategy over and over again, but the smarter player typically will take that information they're given in game 1 and they're not going to fall into the same kind of pitfall or trap that they did in the previous games. So, like I said, best of 3 is all about management with information and how you get the better of your opponent through that management. But yeah, I know this is a pretty generic guide, and I definitely want to do some more best of 3 analysis. I'm thinking of analyzing some of the sets that we've seen from best of 3 from previous years and this year, but I can definitely recommend you guys to watch the St. Louis stream matches, because there were a ton of best of 3 matches from their top cut there, and those can give you a good sense of really how to play best of 3. In addition, I'll also link some of my matches from Premier Challenges earlier this year from best of 3 as well, and you can kind of see how I personally go about it, how I change the Pokemon based off the information I'm given and whatnot. But yeah, in general, if you want to get best of 3, just practice a lot. It is difficult really to practice best of 3, so you'd have to, make sure you have people out there who can play those games with you. And really just try to take advantage of getting in all the information and using information to your advantage. That really helps out a lot, because at the end of the day, best of 3 is who can take the information they're given in the previous games and win the next game with it. But yeah, that's it for this Trainer Tip Tuesday, guys. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Check out Road to Rank if you have not already. And yeah, that's it for this one, guys. Don't forget to leave a like if you enjoyed it, and I'll see you tomorrow. Alright, peace.